Welcome to today's Tidely webinar. Thank you for your patience while we got some technical issues sorted out. Let's dive in. Today's guest is Dr. David Crosby. And no, not the one from Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Although after hearing his story, you may agree that he has had just as fascinating a journey. Pastor Crosby has spent more than 5 decades serving the local church, leading congregations across Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana since 1973. He currently serves as pastor of First Baptist Church of Goldthwaite after previously serving for 22 years as the longtime pastor of First Baptist Church New Orleans. He's also led First Baptist Simple, served on numerous denominational boards and committees, helped launch Truett Seminary, and continues to invest in ministry leaders across the country. David grew up as the second of 13 children. Let that boggle your mind. 13 children. Wow. In a pastor's home. And sensing God's call to ministry while attending Baylor University, Sic 'em Bears, where he studied journalism and religion. He later earned both an MDiv from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary and a PhD in religion with a focus on theology and church-state studies. Along the way, he's written editorials for major publications, published 6 books, and built a legacy centered on faithful pastoral leadership. He's been married to his wife, Janet, for 53 years. That is amazing. Together, they have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and through every season of ministry, David has carried a pastor's heart for people, truth, and the local church. Pastor David Crosby, welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be with you.
Yeah, we are excited to have you here. Throughout this whole series, what we're trying to do is cover a pathway, helping churches build a clear, connected pathway from discovery through discipleship. And I'm really excited to have your voice in this space just because you have a very unique set of experiences, of course, over your life as one of 13 children, but also as a pastor who has a long tenure of faithfulness and service. So since you've spent decades pastoring churches and engaging with culture through writing and public conversations, how have those experiences shaped the way you see people today?
Well, Chris, I have a lot of years being a pastor. My father was a pastor before me, so I grew up in a pastor's home, and I have about 5 or 6 brothers now that are either pastors or retired pastors. When we had family reunions, we used to assign a book of the Bible to talk about. And so at the table and in our discussion, we'd start on 1 John and talk about what the meaning was for us. And it's been a great way to spend my life. Journalism added a new dimension to it. I wrote my first stories after I'd already been writing books and articles and thought I was pretty good. And the city desk would send my stories back all scratched up. I'm ink everywhere. I remember the first story I wrote, the copy desk came over and said, "You buried your lead. It's in the 13th paragraph." I had a journalism degree, and I thought I was doing this right. So the idea of writing for a newspaper ended up being very important in my own development in the use of language. And I try not to bury the lead anymore, even when I'm preaching. Make sure that pretty well people know what's up when I start a message. And that's important to me. And then just speaking in plain English, that was something they wanted me to do as a reporter. So they wanted subject, verb, short sentences, short paragraphs. And I employed that simplified way of communicating as a pastor. So I had many professors in my church when I was in New Orleans, because New Orleans Baptist Seminary is right there, and they would come to church. And I just told him up front, I'm trying to reach your 12-year-old when I preach. And I've kind of kept that idea in my brain that if the 12-year-old can understand me, probably the professor can too, and other people in the congregation as well.
Yeah, so keep it simple. Well,
Yeah.
you mentioned journalism. Was there a specific moment, story, or crisis that really changed how you approach ministry or preaching?
There were a lot of stories. One of the things that happened to me was I was a general assignments reporter for the city desk, so I was involved in a gubernatorial election, and I ended up interviewing 3 of the 6 gubernatorial candidates in the state of Louisiana and writing stories about what they told me. And I found them to be pretty much regular people. And in my years as a journalist, that was reinforced with university presidents and other politicians, U.S. senators, U.S. representatives, people that I interacted with as a reporter. I came away thinking, everybody's a regular person. Everybody needs a pastor, no matter who they are. Sometimes if they found out I was a pastor, it changed the way that they would talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
I grew, I guess, to understand that no matter who the person was in my church, I had a couple of billionaires as members while I was in the ministry. I could treat them as regular people because they needed pastors too.
That's good. What do you
So,
think pastors sometimes misunderstand about the communities that they're trying to reach? You mentioned that you had billionaires and other people, and that angle of everybody's a person that needs Jesus. What do you think other pastors might miss or misunderstand?
well, we want to be, as pastors, available and interacting with people of all economic levels, whoever they are. Um, there's a lot of people who are invisible in every community. I would emphasize that to
What do you mean
whoever
by
I'm talking about.
Sure.
We develop paths as pastors that are familiar to us, maybe daily paths. We drive the same way to church from the house and the same way back. And we need to change that if we're going to know our communities. We need to develop patterns of going off the beaten path to areas of our community and people in our community that we don't normally see. I think Compassion Ministries take us there. It's a way for us to introduce our congregation to people in the community that may be invisible to them.
Like a compassion ministry, like a food bank or food pantry or some service.
Oh, yeah.
Like that. So New Orleans is quite a different city from where you are in Goldthwaite. How do you find the invisible people or the new paths? How did you find them in New Orleans versus how you find them now in Central Texas, Hill Country?
Well, in New Orleans, we did a whole range of ministries. We had ministries to the kids in the schools. At one point, we were preparing 300 backpacks of food for kids on the weekend in 7 different schools. We were encouraging our people to be tutors in those public schools in New Orleans, as well as private, wherever we were needed. We were doing events on the campuses of the public schools. We were doing events in the public parks. There were parks there that when Katrina came, we went there and cleaned up those parks and used volunteers to remove trash and mow the spaces and prepare those parks for the people that lived in the community. We became connected in important ways to populations that really didn't come to First Baptist, but that were part of our community. And some of them did start coming to our church site, to the location, but many of them would come to the discipleship and worship events that we created at the park itself.
Hmm.
So in New Orleans, it was dancers on Bourbon Street. We had a ministry that did weekly visits to the clubs on Bourbon Street and elsewhere, just dialoguing with people who were part of that world, finding out what needs they might have. There were a lot of things we did here in Goldthwaite. It's a completely different world, Chris. I can guarantee you
There's no Bourbon Street in Goldthwaite.
There really isn't. There's great need, and there may be things going on here that I'm sure I don't know about.
Well, I wonder, the difference between, in a small town like Goldthwaite, you definitely still have the sin issue, but there's more of an isolation, versus in New Orleans, it seems like people are open and free with whatever they want to do and however they want to live. I wonder what have you seen or what have you thought about in getting people out of those hiding places in Goldthwaite in a meaningful way?
Well, we do food ministry here just like we did it in New Orleans. There is poverty in rural America, just like there is in New Orleans. And in fact, it's fairly extensive in mid-America.
Mm.
People who live week to week on paychecks, who, if a disaster comes, they don't have a fund to draw from. So we are on the major highway that comes through Goldthwaite, and we are frequently helping people who have broken down, their cars have quit or whatever, and they come to our church, just like happened in New Orleans. So we have a developing ministry of food distribution. I've talked to 2 people this week, initiated a conversation with them. They didn't come to me. I went to them and had reason to believe. Someone told me in one case, I'd never met the person, but I went to have a conversation with him about his ability to buy the food that he needed. And that led into a very interesting conversation with a guy who has never been to church, but he's lived here all his life. He knew a few people that I know because I graduated from a high school 15 miles from where I'm sitting right now. I lived in this community for a year and a half and then went off to college. So there are areas of our community where sometimes I'll drive through, I'll make just a random visit, find out who's living there. I'm trying to pay attention when I go to the stores, commercial enterprises, just who's there. When you go to a medical clinic, everybody comes to the clinic in the community. And so I try to have conversations with people sitting in the waiting rooms and find out who they are and why they're here, where they live. I'm a curious person anyway. So I got introduced to Zia, a little 6-month-old baby, in the security line at New Orleans Airport. I was in New Orleans on Tuesday. So it was interesting to meet that little family and see Zia.
Yeah.
Kids are very curious.
They are.
I guess the human creature is curious. From the cradle to the grave, loud noises make us turn our heads, and fancy colors catch our attention. And
so you've spent years listening to people's stories, I'm sure, in your interactions as you travel and then as a journalist and as a pastor. What have you learned about what people are really searching for beneath the surface?
Well, I think that pastors need to realize that stories are important, and that your stories, both personal and borrowed, have a power to connect with people. And sometimes I'll meet members of my churches previously who mentioned the stories that I told. But I work on telling stories because that's what Jesus did, for one thing.
Yeah.
His stories are probably the most famous part of his teachings, or at least they rank right up there.
Mhm.
We can all think of the prodigal son and the good Samaritan and the lost coin and the lost sheep. And knowing and learning how to tell a story is an important part of preaching, of the craft of preaching. If you leave it out, you sound more like a professor than you do like a pastor. If you don't have any stories, maybe you need to get out of your office and start walking down the street and meeting some people and having conversations with them, would be my thought. But most pastors have stories that they can tell, and I think it's an important aspect of our preaching to tell those stories, because we don't know how they're going to connect to the people in the pew, but they really do. And if I am careful telling my stories and consistent with it, I am saying something every Sunday that people are going to remember. It probably won't be the text of my message, the theological ideas that I present. It
The
will
Greek
be the
or Hebrew
stories
word.
that I tell.
Yeah. So how did your journalism degree help contribute to your ability to pastor more effectively? Because it sounds like some people maybe are naturally drawn to people and they can have a conversation with anybody. But was there anything specific about being a journalist that helped you to listen like a journalist?
Well, I do pay attention to who, what, where, and why now.
Hmm.
After a few stories as a reporter, you discover the copy desk wants the name spelled correctly. So I've become pretty tuned into the who, what, where, and why of people and their journeys and what they want to share with me.
So attention to detail and who they are, where they came from.
Yeah, it's pretty important to remember the troubles that people have shared with you, and to be able to ask later on about, how is that son of yours doing? My memory's not as good as it used to be, so I have to write things down. I have little sticky notes everywhere, but one of the places I have them is on the mirror in my bathroom. And Sunday morning, while I'm brushing my teeth, I'm going over names and trying to remember those folks, who they are and their stories, what I know of them, how they're connected, what they've shared with me.
That's great. Well, so it sounds like as a journalist, in the bridge between being a pastor is a journalist would collect a lot of facts and then share those and then move on to what's next. But as a pastor now, you're carrying those, you're praying for those. What does genuine empathy look like in pastoral ministry? And I'm going to add a caveat: without compromising biblical conviction. So you're remembering all these people, you're praying for them, but then how do you empathize with the people on Bourbon Street and the people in the corners of Goldthwaite without compromising? How have you done it over the years?
Well, the first time I went into a cell block, and I've been there many times, but the first time I went in to be locked in by myself in a cell block, I was
Not being arrested, right?
yeah, I was not a convicted criminal. I was there to kind of share with the prisoners and find out if they were interested in conversation. And when that door slammed behind me, I looked at the room I was in, and there were these great big people lifting these weights, and they were all muscled up and tattooed, and they did not look like me. And I thought, oh my goodness, what is going to happen to me? I don't know who these people are or what's going on with them. It was just like being in a surreal world. And I really thought to myself, this is a place I don't fit at all. I don't know who these people are. And I walked through this exercise room that was the first room in that cell block, and I stuck my head into the area where all the bunks were in rows. And I was looking around trying to see who was there when I hear this guy say, Pastor Crosby. And I look up on the second bunk of a row, and here's a fella that I recognize from a church I pastored years ago. And he came in and reintroduced himself. I knew him when he was 12, and he remembered me.
Wow.
And he was in for a long stint for armed robbery. But I left there thinking, I guess I really do know these people. People who have passed through our churches. They are really not different than me.
Oh, that's a good one. So how can you navigate different communities like that, different places of ministry without making assumptions about people? It sounds like something changed there.
Yeah. I think you got to stop making assumptions about people. I had a homeless woman who came to the church, and they came to get me there in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina, and I had helped so many homeless people and hurting people, and people came to church looking for a handout that I'd quit taking my wallet to church because I was broke every Sunday when I went home. I'd given all my money away. And so they told me she wanted to see me, and I felt for my wallet and realized I'd left it, and I was a little relieved. I went out there, and they introduced me to a woman named Annie, who was dressed in the clothing that you'd get at a Goodwill store or maybe at a rescue mission. Nothing really fit her. And I assumed that she had a guy in a car outside the church. I assumed that, she was homeless and living on the street, made lots of assumptions about this woman, but God impressed on me that I needed to help her if I could. So she wanted a place to stay, and we called the rescue mission. They said, we know Annie. She's stayed too many times, but we'll take her one more if you want us to. So I sent her to the rescue mission that day, and she came back to church, and we started helping her in all kinds of ways, and she started pulling people into her orbit, and she fell in the aisle one Sunday morning, and a physician in the church helped Annie out. We started calling her Raggedy Annie. I hate to say that, but she was always dressed in these borrowed clothes that didn't fit. And found out through my assistant, whom I sent with Annie to the doctor on her next visit, that Annie had terminal cancer. And she said to us shortly thereafter, I would need somebody to help me clean out my house. And I said, you have a house? I just couldn't believe she had a house. But what she had was a fourplex that had no utilities, no water, no electricity, had been sort of cleaned out, but she'd been living on the second floor when it wasn't too hot or too cold. So the crew went over there to clean up her house, and the guy that was heading that crew, clean up Andy's house, came to my office that afternoon and brought a big sign about as big as my desk that said, Ann Thompson for governor.
Wow.
And I said, is this Annie on this sign? He says, it is. Ann Thompson had a PhD from Tulane, had taught in several of the universities there in the area, had got just wiped out by Hurricane Katrina, had lost the ability to think from A to B. And that's who Raggedy Annie was.
Man, so you never know where people come from.
Everybody's got a story. I saw a t-shirt here recently, be kind, because everybody's got a story of hurt and pain that you don't know.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. What ended up happening with Annie?
Annie, we put her in an apartment on the 6th floor of an apartment building, got her a hospital bed to lay in. She died of her cancer. She was able to look over the fairgrounds there in New Orleans out the window where she wanted that bed to be. And the last time I saw her, she said, I don't want to die, but I'm ready to die.
Yeah.
I have peace with God.
Wow.
And she, she was trusting in Christ. We had the funeral at our church, and we had several people that came who knew her professionally. But at that point, New Orleans was still a chaos of unfinished projects, disoriented people.
Yeah.
So it was mostly our church that showed up at her funeral and mourned her passing.
So it sounds like you took the time really to connect with her, even though you didn't know where she came from, and eventually learned it. But as a pastor, what are some signs that maybe the church is talking at people instead of truly connecting with them?
Well, I think we have to enter into dialogue with people. I think that's true in rural America, where the town is small and your neighbors are not overwhelmingly, many in numbers. You just have to, we run into the same people over and over again in our space now. I was anonymous in much of New Orleans. If I'd go to a restaurant, nobody knew who I was. The anonymity of the city is part of what you have to embrace when you live in a big urban area. But, I think you've got to be authentic yourself. I think people are looking for authenticity in ministers. You can tell stories that help people know who you are, know your weaknesses as well as your strengths, your failures as well as your successes.
What do you think helps people trust a pastor or a church today? Is it authenticity? Is it more than that?
I think getting to know them. I think they trust you as you interact with them in the auditorium, at their pew, as you remember and learn their names. This is small town America, so I have 200 people at church, Sunday instead of thousands like some pastors do.
Well, and you mentioned, being in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. I remember a friend of mine got married there, and they did not reschedule their wedding, but I feel like it was a year afterwards. And going down there, it still looked like a war zone. There were sides of buildings gone, cars upside down, where they would paint on the house the number of survivors or the number of not survivors that they found in there. It all felt very, like you said, chaotic. How can pastors, since you've led through a difficult time like that, how could other pastors lead people compassionately through fear, conflict, and uncertainty?
Well, I think in disaster, it's very important that you live moment by moment and day by day. It's very hard to plan for the future in a disaster. It's something new every time. Every time you go to the church, every time the phone rings, it's just something different, something you didn't expect or anticipate. So I think part of what happens when disaster strikes in your community is that you have to slow down for a minute and just handle the daily things that are coming at you. And if you are mobilizing first just to relieve people of the pain and hurt and the trouble that they're in. So there are stages to it,
Yeah.
But we were ourselves in the disaster. Both my daughters lost their homes in Hurricane Katrina. We didn't lose ours. We had the flood come right up to our threshold, but it didn't come into our house.
Wow.
80% of the houses in our neighborhood flooded, but ours was one of those that was spared. So we had over 200 people stay with us post-Katrina in probably that first or second year. Some of them were volunteers and crew members. Some of them were folks out of the church who lost their homes. But responding to crisis is a moment-by-moment thing, as that's how I experienced it. We tried to do planning in those early days. Nothing we planned happened.
So, well, moving on to a different sort of crisis that I think is happening in America today, related to division and outrage and skepticism. How can people communicate, or how can pastors communicate truth in a way that people are willing to hear when they're in those situations? So, first, do you think it's similar to disaster recovery, or a different approach?
Well, my approach is to focus every message in some way on Jesus.
Hmm.
Jesus is popular with everybody. I may not be, but Jesus is popular with everybody. And I want people to know Jesus because he is the way, the truth, and the life.
Amen.
And so I am seeking to unfold the person and work of Christ in every message, whether I'm in Proverbs or Psalms or Genesis or Mark or the epistles, to give them the words that Jesus spoke, to introduce Jesus to them in different ways as you present the text of Scripture, and to end with an invitation for them to enter into a relationship with Jesus or to deepen that relationship, to call them to follow him and walk with him and to follow his instructions, and the truths which he unfolds and the challenges that he gives to us in living our own lives. So I think Jesus is the keystone for every church. He is the foundation. He's the one, beginning and the end.
Amen. Keep
And
teaching Jesus.
if you're walking with Jesus, Jesus looked at this young ruler that came to him, and Mark says he loved him.
Hmm.
That's what Mark records about the first encounter Jesus has with this guy. Jesus looked at him and loved him.
That's
So
great.
I'm praying that I can do that with people, that I can love them when I meet them, and that I express that love by not being focused on myself or fulfilling the need in me to tell them something, but I can express that love by listening to them, hearing them, maybe picking up on the anxiety in their life and responding in a compassionate way to what I'm hearing.
Hmm.
Uh, I think that's probably the way that Jesus would have us do it.
Yeah, I agree. How, from a functional standpoint, how has your understanding of preaching changed over the years, or has it?
Um, I'm still pretty much an expository preacher. I take a text and walk through it. Um, I think the story today, as an older preacher, I'm even more convinced that the stories are important, that the illustrations are important, and that we need to follow Jesus and how he preached and presented his message. Um, so I encourage young preachers, and we have young preachers on the staff, encourage them to learn how to tell stories, um, how to tell a story inside out or upside down, where
Good.
you are not revealing the punchline, where there's surprise in the narrative, uh, where you are describing experiences that people have and using those to illustrate the truth that you want to share. So I plan my preaching, and I think that has helped me.
How far out do you plan your messages?
Well, right now I'm planning through July
Okay.
and basically through August, because I've got an associate who does a good bit of the preaching too. And so I know where I'm headed on each one of those Sundays. And it helps me to have a text that is self-assigned,
Hmm.
It's like, okay, I'm going to preach on Psalm 1 on June 7th, Psalm 2 on June 14th, Psalm 3. So I've got a plan for those months, and then I'm going to focus on Jesus in the Psalms, and I'm going to focus on the literary device of parallelism to help people see how often it occurs in Hebrew literature and what its advantage is in understanding the psalm and in sharing its truth. As C.S. Lewis's comments in his reflections on the Psalms, parallelism is a unique feature of Hebrew poetry that is not lost in translation to English or any other language in the world.
Yeah.
It's a way of saying the same thing twice, or saying it in a different way, or as C.S. Lewis says, doing a two-step dance.
It's a good
So,
Texas tie-in right there.
yeah. So you take that parallelism as a way of learning the truth that the writer's communicating. And he observes that Jesus was soaked in this parallelism, which I think is such an important and insightful thing. If you read Jesus thinking about parallelism, you realize, hey, he's saying that here in this place. Judge not, you be not judged. With the judgment you render, it will be judged. You'll be judged, and with the measure by which you measure others, you will be measured too. So I've got to shorten. I get more wordy as I get old, and I need to not do that. And I need to not be always telling my own story, because that's what old people do often. They can't tell their own story.
Same story.
So,
my wife gets on to me for telling the same story over and over again, but I remember that's how we got here.
Really, I guess that's a role that wives play in our lives.
They remind us how often we've told the story.
Yes.
Well, you mentioned, so in telling stories, you got to be a good listener. So what are some practical ways that pastors can become better listeners in everyday ministry?
I think we can develop some questions to ask. You know, how you doing today?
What's a good journalism question that brings out some story?
Tell me about how you got to this place. You know, to really understand what somebody's saying. Maybe it's helpful to get a little narrative from them about their own journey. If they can start talking about their journey, you will learn more about how the insights of the gospel can meet them where they are.
Yeah.
So a lot of it's just letting them talk. And after they've talked, responding with things that the Holy Spirit maybe is bringing to your mind as they talk.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to listen to our people.
That's good.
All kind of ways.
Well, if a pastor wanted to better understand their community this month, where should they start?
You might want to start driving the streets, you know.
Driving the streets on your feet? Or
Maybe
just driving
Yeah.
around, looking around?
Yeah, kind of doing a little tour. Maybe walking down to the town square, which is what we have here, and just walking around, seeing who you meet.
Yeah.
And maybe going into some of the stores, meeting folks that you hadn't met before. Hey, I'm the pastor down at the church. I've done this. If you need anything in your business that I can help with, let me know. Or talking to the fire chief or the mayor or the city manager, talking to folks who are in your church about how can I help you in your work? Is there a place that you'd like me to show up as a pastor? They may have employees or folks that they work with. I've had that happen. I've given call to people who are just co-workers that members have said, why don't you call him? He's having a hard time. But responding to those requests.
Pastoral voice.
Yeah. You know, that may be a little difficult for us to do. It's sort of like a cold call. Hey, my name's David Crosby, and I know a colleague of yours. But I just wanted to let you know that I'm new to the community and I'm pastor down at First Baptist. So if you need me for something, I'd be delighted for you to call on me.
Does that context translate from New Orleans, the big city, to Goldthwaite, the small town?
For sure. Yeah, if you make yourself available in the city, you will get many invitations. People are interested in what's happening in your churches.
Mm.
In fact, I served on with 3 police chiefs in New Orleans on their clergy advisory committee. And they had half a dozen pastors who they would take out to eat for lunch every month or two and just say to them, how's the police force doing in your faith community?
Yeah.
How's our reputation? What are we doing wrong? You know?
Hmm.
And that's an amazing eye opener to hear from those black pastors about how the police force is doing in their community. You know,
Yeah.
what the reputation is, what are your people saying? It's an eye opener to hear from the different pastors and different groups of people.
Yeah, the people
How
groups.
they're doing in the community. That was the most interesting thing. One of the most interesting things I did as a pastor in New Orleans.
So staying connected, being in touch with all the different people groups, civic organizations, public service.
I remember showing up at a meeting that for an organization that was trying to minister to battered women. And this was in New Orleans. Of course, it's heavily Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
I met people who had never met a Baptist before, they said. I showed up at this meeting and the lady says, well, now who are you? And I said, I'm David Crosby, the pastor of First Baptist Church in New Orleans. She said, Baptist? I'm so glad you're here. Most of our clients are Baptists. That wasn't really good news to me. That's what she thought of. And I think it was just a spontaneous remark. I don't think she was trying to be mean. But I suppose it must have been true. Maybe most of her battered women clients really were Baptists.
Yikes. Wow. Well, David, as we get a little closer to a close, what gives you hope about the church today?
What gives me hope?
Yes, sir.
Well, I am full of hope because of Jesus our Lord, who is in charge of the future. I don't know what the future holds, but I know he holds the future, and I'm very relieved by that kind of worn cliche. But it's definitely true. The Church of Jesus Christ is vibrant in many places in the world, including many places in our own country. And there are many people who are looking for spiritual solutions. It's not the way it used to be. Our churches are not the social centers that they were 50 years ago, in rural America included. Many other things are taking up that space. But there is great need for community, for people who are willing to open their circle and let strangers in. And there are people looking for a place. So I think the koinonia of the church is very important, and that it is an opportunity for us, if we are willing to be open to other people, maybe people unlike ourselves even, they will join the circle if we let them. They'll come in, and they may come in as pre-Christian, not really believing yet, but curious about who we are. I preach as if I am preaching to at least some secularists, atheists, people who don't have answers, people who are looking for answers, people who are confused. And I think when I do that, I address the true heart condition of more people than we realize.
Sure. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Well, as we close today, what's one thing you hope pastors remember when they think about reaching people today?
That those people need to be loved, and they need to see the practical action of love in the Church of Jesus Christ. If we're going to be known as followers of Jesus by our love, that's got to be on the front. And I don't think we can leave that just to the personal preference of the person in the pew. I think we need to somehow work the love of people into the church calendar, the church budget, the church staff, the church organism and organization, so that it's not some afterthought or we just hope that gets done.
That's great. So it sounds like a church that goes beyond a Sunday, that is more about connecting people to friendship and extending the love of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got T-shirts around here that say the church has left the building.
That's great. Send me one of those.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been insightful talking to you and hearing your heart. And I, as a pastor's son, am encouraged that your father led your family so well, that you're leading your family well, and that you're continuing in faithful ministry. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for following the Lord, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed being with you.
Y'all have a good one.
All right.